Welcome back to TAD Talks, where every week I sit down with my dad and sustainability expert Tad Radzinski to ask him questions about sustainability topics. Last week we talked about the strategies to mitigate or reduce the risks of climate change while growing our economy at the same time. If you haven't seen that yet, you can watch that on Tad's YouTube channel. Today we are going to talk about how companies and government agencies are working to reduce their carbon footprints. So let's get started. First, let's go with the basics as usual. What is a carbon footprint?
So when we hear the term carbon footprint, what that is, basically companies are looking at all the energy they use in everything they do. And every one of us has a carbon footprint, right? Because think about it, if we're using electricity in our homes, we have a carbon footprint because there's combustion of fuels that usually goes into making electricity in many cases. Or if we're heating our homes with natural gas or propane or oil, there's a carbon footprint when we burn that fuel to heat the home. And same thing with driving our cars. When we drive our cars, we're using gasoline and we're basically burning gasoline, and there's CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gases that come out of that. Same thing for a company. If a company is trying to understand their carbon footprint, they're going to be looking at all the electricity they use in all their buildings and operations. They're going to be looking at the fuels they use for heating or for manufacturing products, or the fuels they use in their vehicles to transport products to us. You know, if they're shipping things to like a distribution center or that kind of thing, the fuel, if they own the fleet of trucks, then they would be responsible for that. Same thing for a government agency or a college and university. Anybody that has buildings or that kind of thing, they're going to basically be using electricity, be using different fuels for heating, and also they might have a fleet of vehicles and things like that they have to consider. And when we talk about those things, most companies are going to look at it from the perspective of any kind of fuel directly used in their operation, like if they're using natural gas. For us, if I'm using gasoline in my car or propane to heat my house, that's called scope 1, okay? That's how we look at it from when we're doing greenhouse gas accounting and carbon footprinting. If they're using electricity, that's from indirect sources in most cases, where the electricity comes from the power plants, and they call that scope 2. And then another important thing to think about, most companies and all of us actually have suppliers, right? So they're getting products and materials and different things to make their products and the goods and services that they provide. So their supply chain is called scope 3, and that's what they're responsible for. Other things in scope 3 are the waste they generate. It's also their employee travel and things like that. So different organizations, different companies might be tracking carbon footprint from maybe just scope 1 and 2, looking at their direct fuels and electricity. Some of them are going bigger and looking at what is their total footprint with scope 3 included.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah, definitely. So once someone understands what their carbon footprint is, what are some things they can do to reduce their carbon footprint?
Okay. So the first thing that companies are going to do, or you and I are going to do, is we're going to measure our carbon footprint. And we do that by looking at all the fuels we use, how much electricity we used over a year. If we're going to look at our suppliers, we have to understand where our suppliers located, how are they shipping products to us, what is the impact of their operations. So what the companies do is they basically measure all that. They call that baselining and benchmarking. And usually what they're going to do is measure it against maybe a unit of production. So, you know, let's just say, for example, we're talking about cell phones. If a company was trying to understand their carbon footprint, they might say, our carbon footprint is X amount of greenhouse gases per number of cell phones that we manufacture in a year. You know, that way they can measure based on production or something like that. So they're basically going to measure all that. And then once they know where they are, they're going to then say, okay, we have different ways we can reduce our carbon footprint. We can be more efficient in the energy we use. We can use less energy, less electricity, less fuels. They can do things like buy renewable energy credits, or they could install renewable energy on their building, or they could buy carbon offsets, or a combination of all of them. So we do a lot of work where we'll come into manufacturing plants and we do what we call sustainable operations assessments, or we're going to go into the plant. First thing we're going to do is look at the benchmark and baseline data. If they don't have it, we help them develop it. So then we'll say, all right, we know how much electricity you use, how much water, how much natural gas, and we know exactly then what the affiliated carbon footprint is with that for this. These are the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. And then what we do is we look for opportunities to save energy. So we might go in there and identify opportunities to replace their lighting with more efficient bulbs. Or we might find opportunities so that they can run their heating, ventilating, and air conditioning equipment more efficiently, or fix leaks in their compressed air systems, or a myriad of things, anything that we can do. And a lot of times we find that they can do things for very little cost, but save a lot of money. We just did a sustainable operations assessment a couple weeks ago, and we found that just all the low and no cost things that the company could do would save them $150,000.
Wow.
So not only is it good to reduce the carbon footprint, but they're going to save money at the same time, which is really exciting.
Mm-hmm.
So for me and you, if we wanted to reduce our own carbon footprint, we could think about saving electricity in our home, turning things off when we're not using them, or buying more efficient products, or different things like that. We could maybe drive our car less, or take a shorter shower, things like that to reduce the fuels and electricity we use. We would reduce our own, and that in turn gives us cost savings. Like, I'd rather have the money in my pocket and do something fun with the money than give it to the electric utility.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the same approach we do with companies.
Awesome, absolutely. So you mentioned that there are emissions associated with suppliers. Is there anything that companies can do to reduce the carbon footprint of their products?
Absolutely. And what companies do is typically they're going to look at the products that we use every day, and they're going to do what we call a life cycle assessment. And that they're going to understand what are the environmental impacts of the products that they make, and they're going to start with the materials and the ingredients, and they're going to look at that. There's software used to measure that. Then they're going to look at the transportation of those materials and ingredients to their factory, their operation and manufacturing they're going to look at. They're going to basically measure that. Then they're going to look at the transportation of getting those end products out to the distribution centers, eventually to us, and then we're going to use them. So we call that, we're basically looking at the products across the entire life cycle from cradle to grave, unfortunately, is what we call it. Ideally, we want to go cradle to cradle, or closing the loop where we don't create any waste. And then what they can do is, once they understand all that, by using life cycle assessment software, they can understand where in the life cycle are the impacts happening. Is it the raw materials or the ingredients they use? Is it their manufacturing? Is it the transportation, etc.? They can evaluate that, and then they could also determine if they make a product that uses energy, for example, like a cell phone or a laptop or a TV or any other device, a refrigerator. Are there things they can do that can reduce the electricity use in the use phase when you and I are using it, and they can try to make it more efficient that way. So by understanding all that, they're going to evaluate different things they can do to make their products more sustainable. That in turn would, again, reduce costs for them, and we reduce something called embodied carbon in the products. So when we're measuring the life cycle impacts, we're understanding how many greenhouse gases were created from burning the fuels of making the raw materials, getting them to the factory, then actually manufacturing the product in the factory and then sending it out. That first beginning phase of life of a product is basically where we would look at what's called the embodied carbon of making it. So they can try to reduce that embodied carbon. Then they could also think about use phase. What can they do to reduce the carbon emissions by making something more efficient from an energy perspective? It's really exciting, and there's a lot going on with it right now. So, I think we can talk more about that in the future as well. Mm-hmm. So it's great.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you so much. Next week, we will be talking about how companies can design products and packaging to be more sustainable, recyclable, and reusable.